In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Veni Sancti Spiritus repletuorum corda fidelium et tui amoris in eis ignem accende. Emite Spiritum tuum et creabuntur. Oremus Deus qui corda fidelium Sancti Spiritus illustratione locuisse da nobis in iodem Spiritus recta sapere et de eius semper consolatione gaudere per Christum Dominum nostrum. Sede sapientiae. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So now we'll continue considering the consequences of Luther's marriage, remember, to a former nun. Of course, Luther was highly prominent at this time, so his marriage, real or otherwise, didn't go unnoticed by any means. And in fact, all those nations that remained Catholic, of course, found it abhorrent. But Luther, of course, by this time, was accustomed only to listen to the voice of his own passions, and not to any of the rest of the world, which at this point was still partially sane anyway. So it was also around this time that he began to gather his friends and just start talking to them without any shame or remorse about anything he would say, and of course giving free rein to his impure mind against the Catholic Church, loading it with insults. This is what's known as the collection of which is known as his table talks. It was these were gathered up by his admirers in essentially transcripts of what he said while he was lounging around the table with his friends and family. And so he's in a sense the guards are down even more than usual when he's doing that. Of course, he may have been after a few beers or something. So he was there were really no guards around at that point. So he would just say whatever would come to mind. And so whenever you hear references to his table talks, that's what it is, and that's at least started around this time. Of course, Luther gave tremendous scandal where he was ordained a priest and he had taken a vow of chastity. And the scandal that he gave by attempting to marry, of course, was going to spread among his supporters. The most zealous and powerful of which was the Landgrave Philip of Hesse. We've talked about him before. We've touched on him before. And he was always a protector of Luther, of Protestantism in general. But now he sees that he himself can profit from the fact that Luther has just married. So he had been himself married for quite some time, had a number of children, but he decided that, let's put it this way, he wasn't exactly the model of chastity even for the married state. So he had been living, in fact, in a state of concubinage, and so he decided to have that legitimized or attempt to have that legitimized, and to have his mistress made into a second wife. That was his idea. So in order to get this, he decided to write to Luther and Melanchthon. Remember, Luther has essentially set himself up as a pope. Has arrogated to himself infallibility, things like that. Has decided that anybody who personally interprets the scriptures will necessarily come to the same conclusions that he does because he's infallible. And if anyone else is truly inspired, then he would come to the same conclusions as Luther himself. So Philip of Hesse, the Landgrave, writes to Luther and Melanchthon, stating that though he had been married for 16 years to Christina, the daughter of the Duke George of Saxony, and was the father of 8 children, Nevertheless, he wished to obtain their authorization for a second and simultaneous union with this Margaret Saal, her name was. Who was a maid of honor to his sister Elizabeth. So that's not terribly important, but that's how he first saw her. Of course, Luther and Melanchthon were in a state of perplexity over this because clearly, obviously, Scripture, it doesn't take any imagined personal interpretation or private inspiration to see that sacred Scripture very definitely forbids adultery, which is what Philip is essentially asking for. So they don't, in a sense, it would be against it would be disadvantageous to them to grant this to him. But on the other hand, Philip is threatening to, if they refuse, to return to the Catholic Church, apparently. Now, how serious that threat is, I don't know, but that's what he's threatening because he wants this. He probably would not have, because obviously if the Pope is refusing or has refused, Pope Clement VII obviously refused a divorce to Henry VIII, he's not going to permit a bigamy to Philip of Hesse. Obviously not. So Philip essentially wants to return to the polygamy of the patriarchal times. You know, I mentioned that in the early centuries of the earth, yes, the patriarchs of the Old Testament were permitted to have multiple wives. But that's not permitted by the natural law anymore. So the reformers, quote-unquote reformers, are in a bind here, and they take some time to consider their options, what risk do they want to run, destroying their credibility or losing the protection of Philip of Hesse. And they opt to lose their credibility because they decide to consent to the Landgrave's request, and they signed some sort of act permitting him to marry again. And they said that it was to enable him to promote the advantage of both body and soul and the greater glory of God. That's what they said. So essentially, they're permitting him, giving him positive permission to have two wives because they see it's good for their sect, which again, they see as being the church, the true church of Christ, and to be in possession of the true gospel. They suggested that as it is now not a usual thing to have two wives at once, we judge that the ceremony should be performed privately and in the presence of a few necessary witnesses. So he said, yes, it's all right, do it because essentially we need you on our side, but do it quietly because this really is going to look bad. So you can see that they're not exactly martyrs, Luther and Melanchthon. Of course, in the true sense, they're not at all. I mean, even if they were to stand up for, in this case, for the indissolubility of marriage, and that it's between one man and one woman, obviously. But even if they had stood up for it, they wouldn't be martyrs in the true sense because they've been separated from the Catholic Church for quite some time. But they don't have any spine at all, clearly, if they're giving this to him, because they need his protection. But nevertheless, word did get out that the Landgrave of Hesse has two wives with the approval of Luther, and that causes, of course, great infamy, the greatest scandal throughout the rest of the world, which remains Catholic. And even among Protestants, this was looked upon unfavorably. The Catholics and Protestants, who were a little less extreme, alike stigmatized the shameless conduct of the Landgrave and also the cowardice of Luther and Melanchthon in pandering to his base passion. So Luther thought he could justify himself, or he attempted to justify his actions by appealing to his own supreme authority. Again, he's arrogating to himself now not only papal infallibility, but powers that the Pope doesn't even profess to have. In other words, to allow a man to be married to two women at once is obviously that's not something the Pope can permit. The natural law prescribes one man, one woman, no other possible formulas. Of course, today there are many other formulas which are considered possible, but this was a time when things weren't quite so insane. So the Pope obviously can't dispense with that formula, with that, with the prescription of the natural law in this regard. But Luther is saying that he has more power than even the Pope, essentially. Of course, not that he's conceding that the Pope has any power, but he's claiming powers which he would not even say the Pope himself claims. So Luther sought to justify this with an appeal to his own supreme authority, which he claimed empowered him under certain circumstances to rise above the ordinary laws and to decide in opposition to received customs. So now he's reducing the natural law to just a set of customs. This was, as we pointed out, to proclaim his own authority while denying that of the Church. It was a solemn acknowledgement that he had rejected the supremacy of the Pope only to set up his own. Our author here spelling out what we've observed long ago. But, funny what the author says next, all these inconsistencies gave very little trouble to Luther and his adherents. In other words, they don't care. They're being inconsistent, being nonsensical, but they don't care. It doesn't matter to them anymore. Catholic theologians might point them out, but they hardly ever met with a reply. So, they're far beyond being reasoned with. So, now we go to other examples of turmoil caused by the Protestant Revolution. We go to the scene of Westphalia, which of course would become famous later on for other reasons, which was itself becoming the field of new struggles and new excesses. In the beginning of 1533, here's an example of more revolution. The city of Munster was disturbed by two men who were dressed oddly, and went through the streets crying aloud, "Do penance, the vengeance of the Heavenly Father is at hand." So now we've got new self-proclaimed prophets here. One of them was an innkeeper, and another was an executioner. Yeah, their names are not all that important, but this is just an example of the kind of thing that Luther is giving rise to. So, in any case, their names were John Beckelson and John Knipper Döling, who was an executioner. They're not very famous people, but they caused trouble like this. They were fanatics that had been first led away by Luther's reform, but then become Anabaptists. Have I explained the tenets of the Anabaptists before? Is that clear that essentially they reject infant baptism? They say that you have to be baptized as an adult with the use of reason for it to be valid. So they started out as Lutherans and then became Anabaptists, who are more extreme. Then, let's see. So one of these people, John Beckelson, or also known as John of Leyden, was surrounded by an immense throng who were asking for a baptism because they'd probably all been baptized as infants. Then when he thought his party was strong enough to warrant the attempt, he took up arms against the Prince of Waldeck, who was also the Bishop of Munster, and succeeded in capturing the city. So they're just taking over another city here. We've seen this sort of thing before. All books and manuscripts other than the Bible, with paintings and statues of the saints, were brought to the supposed prophet, who ordered the instruments of what he called a popish idolatry to be destroyed. They were burned amid profane dances and excesses of an unbridled and shameless libertinism. So our author is very reserved in how he describes these events, but basically there was all kinds of filthy activity going on as they were destroying the externals of the Catholic faith. So on this day of profanation, Munster was styled the City of Zion. Obviously, it's anything but that. And John of Leyden received the title of king. So that's a quick way to get a promotion from innkeeper to king, is lead a group of fanatics in a supposed religious revolution. Well, revolution certainly, but not religious. Then let's see. So he gets promoted from prophet to king, and after that, a baker takes over the position of prophet. So everybody's getting promotions. And the executioner we mentioned earlier was named Generalissimo of the hosts of the Lord. So these people must have been crazy to some extent. I don't know if they were diagnosed with any mental illness, but they must have had. So the prince bishop, who is in the meantime, his territory is the place all this insanity is taking place. He raised a force of Catholic soldiers at his own expense and besieged the city. So the city's in turmoil and rebellion, revolt. He besieges it with a force raised at his own expense. And after 6 months, the rebels finally gave way. The prophet, who's by this time the king, and that of his execution and that of his adherents, delivered Munster from this tyranny, and was the just punishment of all of the crimes that took place in the city during their occupation. So finally was put to that in January of 1536. So that's just one example. Perhaps on a rather large scale, but one example of what happens when people take Luther's principles to their ultimate conclusions. But of course, it didn't stop there. Protestantism was still spreading all over Germany in like a torrent. The excesses of the fanatical peasantry and the extravagant folly of the Anabaptists should have withheld the princes of the area in a course so dangerous to their authority. In other words, they should have seen very clearly, not only from the principles that Luther was enunciating, but also from these consequences, that it's a really bad thing for them to continue to support this revolution. But they still held on for other reasons. Again, with Frederick, he was the Elector of Saxony, and we saw Luther waited for his death in order to marry, as well as, of course, Philip of Hesse and others. One in particular, the Prince of Anhalt, were the first to declare themselves openly in favor of the cause of the Reformation. It was then successively embraced by states of northern Germany and Prussia, through the apostasy of one Albert of Brandenburg, who was the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, who consented to purchase a crown at the price of a sacrilege. So, anyone know who the Teutonic Knights were, by any chance? Yes, you have any idea? All right. They were a Crusader order, yes, of Germans who did crusade in the Middle East, and then after that came to an end, then they transferred to Germany. There are similar orders like the other famous examples, the Templars, the Knights of St. John, Hospitallers, who of course also known as the Knights of Malta because they successfully defended Malta from the Turks. But that's a couple of decades in the future, a few decades. Yes. Possibly, yes. Yeah, I'm not. I haven't done any in-depth research into them. Although this Albert of Brandenburg famously became a Protestant. All right, and then again, all these princes banding together in favor of Protestantism founded what was called the League of Schmalkalden, which is the name of a town where it was founded. Make sure I spelled that correctly. Yes. So it was first drawn up and subscribed to by Johann, who's the Elector of Saxony, and Ernest, the Duke of Brunswick, in February of 1531. So other members affixed their signatures to the document at the town of Schmalkalden on March 29th of the same year. So it was founded in 1531. So there were a number of members, in addition to the ones we just mentioned. Also, there was Prince Wolfgang of Anhalt. There were other couple of counts, one of Mansfeld, the townships of Strasbourg, Ulm, Konstanz, Reutlingen, Memmingen, Lindau, other places in the full list. I don't expect you to memorize every name on the list, but just understand that there was a league of Protestant princes who joined together in support of the ongoing revolution. So it's really spreading, in other words. And it's becoming more formal, people who are involved in it. And Sweden was perverted by its king, Gustav Vasa, and also Denmark by its king, Christian II, and his successor, Frederick I, successively joined the ranks of the reformers, so as it's spreading into Scandinavia. Norway followed their example, and Iceland also received the new heresy. So it's really spreading. The sovereigns, these various leaders, kings, were easily led to join the Lutheran cause by hoping to share in the spoils of the clergy, which the Reformation placed in their hands. And because Luther is clearly giving to all of these rulers absolute power in their regions. Has everyone ever heard that the saying, right, of course, originating in Protestantism, cuius regio eius religio? Anyone familiar with that? In other words, whose region it is also his religion. So might want to remember that. Cuius regio eius religio. Which is interesting because obviously that's giving absolute authority to a ruler in his territory, which means that the idea of totalitarianism, of absolute civil authority, comes from Protestantism, not from the Catholic Church. Because, as we've seen, all these clashes between popes and civil rulers, many times, sometimes it's true, it's purely political clashes, but many times it's a question of the pope keeping the civil rulers in their places. So under a system in which everybody is Catholic, there is a very definitely a limit on the authority of the civil power. There are things they very definitely cannot do, like give ecclesiastical jurisdiction, which is why there was such a struggle for a long time over lay investiture. So the church, when everywhere in Europe was Catholic, there wasn't any question. Civil rulers did not have absolute authority. They were not in charge of ecclesiastical matters. But now, because of Luther's principle, we're seeing this rise of total absolute authority being given to the civil rulers. So that's something you can bring up because it's a popular notion. The Catholic Church is so cruel and tyrannical, and democracy comes from Protestantism. It's true that there are certain false principles, certain false ideas of how authority works that come from Protestantism. But the idea that absolute authority being invested in the civil power comes from Protestantism, not from the Catholic Church, not by any means. In fact, it's only as a result of the revolution against the Church that it arose. So that's an interesting and very useful point you could bring up if you ever an argument with an educated Protestant. So, again, these sovereigns are easily induced to join the revolution because of all of the wealth that they will get if they join it, throw off the authority of the church, and therefore have no fear of any sort of reprisals from the church, for what they consider to be the church, by stealing all the wealth of the Catholic Church. So the nobles also, again, that was the sovereigns, the nobles looked upon the step as a means of freeing themselves from the restraint of episcopal authority, and to appropriate to the wealth of the monasteries, which they beheld with a covetous eye, or had been looking at with covetous desires for a long time. Ecclesiastics and religious, who were unworthy of their vocation, longed for freedom to follow the bent of their natural inclinations. And we know what that means. So essentially everybody's seeing this as a chance to go on a jailbreak, as they see it. They really want to throw off all of the restraints which the church has put on any aspect of their lives. Whether it's with regard to the passions or with regard to the wealth of the church in these areas, people want to steal it, or on the part of the peasants, and taxes they don't like. Everybody has some motive to get involved in this. Some material motive, or worse. And then, of course, we're talking here about sovereigns, nobles, and religious, who, of course, were higher than, say, the average peasants, but even the multitude who just allowed themselves to be carried on by the impulse which was leading the world to general corruption and immorality. But again, we have seen earlier how there was unhappiness, malcontent in areas where the church was imposing some form of taxes for the support of the church. That was seen as burdensome. Whether it was or not is another question. It's just that's how it was seen. And as a result, these peasants took advantage of general rebellion against the church to throw it off. And then also some of those nations, those more northern nations, had only recently been introduced to the faith to begin with. So, and as a result, their religious instruction was at best incomplete if it hadn't been just outright neglected. So they were very easily prey to heresies. They weren't even able to distinguish, so they easily went along with it. They couldn't even detect what the problems were. Which is not to say that had they known, they would necessarily have rejected it. Clearly, we've seen that areas in Germany, which had long been Catholic, rejecting the faith in favor of novelties, new heresies. But it just makes it that much easier for them to go along with it because they don't even know how to answer it in the first place. Yes. Yeah, have some earlier. Yes, again, I don't have the dates for all of these countries, but relatively recently introduced to the faith. Yeah, not more than a few centuries. Though this is not to say that there was no resistance at all, of course, among people who were actually faithful to the church. In fact, our author says that the Reformation often met with a vigorous resistance which checked its triumphant career for some time. So he doesn't give too many examples of it, but to the general spread, there were pockets of resistance. And also the reformers had sent their emissaries into France, but the French government, King Francis I, they were generally vigilant in fighting against it. And there was, of course, a strong attachment to the faith among French people in general. So they didn't make much headway there at first. Although, of course, we'll see later on in the future centuries, there will be wars of religion in France. So it would get there eventually. But at this point, then French in general are still rejecting it. In fact, King Francis, at the head of his court, went in solemn procession to restore a statue of the Blessed Virgin which had been mutilated by a Protestant. So that was in itself certainly an act of piety. And then now we go on to another famous heretic, John Calvin, who was born in France in 1509. He was the son of a cooper, which means someone who makes barrels. and subsequently held the offices of apostolic notary and secretary to the bishop. So he was involved in ecclesiastical positions in the diocese, fairly important, at least in the diocese. He enabled himself to study literature and canon law, or he was enabled through a benefactor to devote himself to the study of literature and canon law at a few universities in France. And it's interesting that he was, as a student, generally successful except in theology, to which he gave less attention. But of course, he'd become famous later on for supposedly being a theologian. That's code for heretic in this case. But it's just interesting to show that even as a student, it was not his strong point, and he didn't even focus on it particularly. He gave it less attention. Yes. It seems so. You wouldn't be holding positions of apostolic notary if you were not. It doesn't actually, our author doesn't actually give a date for any ordination, so I'd have to check it, but it would seem so. Let's see. So he never had a very good reputation. His character was reputed to be bad, and apparently his morals were infamous. And then he eventually teamed up with Theodore Beza, so another heretic who would follow him. So it's John Calvin. And he would later set up in Switzerland, Geneva, but he was originally from France, John Calvin, and then he teams up with Theodore Beza. So again, they would, yes. I think so, yeah, because Beza was like essentially the successor of Calvin. He was a disciple and then a successor. And then it was St. Francis de Sales did go to Geneva to try to convert. So most likely, he's the famous Beza, so in all likelihood it's the same one, unless he's a relative or descendant or something, but most likely it's the same one. So again, Beza would become, in a sense, one of the patriarchs of Protestantism in France in the future. So, of course, Luther eventually joins the Reformation. He becomes a Protestant, and he was chiefly occupied with ideas of justification. Because he was expressing these principles, he was obliged to leave Paris. He was kicked out of the Sorbonne in Paris and had to get out because they didn't want his ideas there. So again, we've seen Luther also had errors on justification, but Calvin diverged from Luther in allowing man some kind of liberty, whereas Luther, of course, refused altogether. So Luther said there's no free will. Calvin admitted some degree of it. But even that he subjected to predestination, which he also had a predestination to hell. We'll talk about that. And which was in fact the predominant characteristic of Calvin's system, this absolute predestination, including to hell, which is false. That's heresy. So again, according to Calvin, God is the primordial author of good and evil, and has from all eternity cast off a portion of his creatures and doomed them to eternal punishment in order to show his justice in them. So he's saying that God is essentially the author of moral evil. Again, it can be said that God is the author of certain physical evils, or he can inflict punishment, which is in some sense an evil, but God can obviously never be the cause of sin. He may permit sin to be committed in order to bring about some greater good, but God is in no sense the author of sin. That has to be understood very clearly. And again, in the Catholic system, the Catholic faith holds that, yes, there are those who are predestined to heaven before foreseen merits, but nobody is predestined to hell. Those who are sent to hell are sent there after foreseen demerits. So, again, you'll see all of that in De Gratia. That we're not going to get into all of that now, but just understand that there's no such thing as this absolute predestination to hell. That's false. So again, in Calvin's system, to give just motives for wrath and punishment, Calvin holds that God caused the first man to fall by sin, so he says he caused Adam to sin, and involved the whole of Adam's posterity in the revolt. So he holds that actual sins are imposed upon men by the divine will, which excites to the commission of crime those whom it has predestined to eternal loss. So he's essentially saying that God forces people to sin in order to send them to hell. Let that sink in. That blasphemy. So that's his theory. That's not sufficiently gloomy for you. I don't know what is. So he's effectively destroyed free will. Again, he professes that there is such a thing as free will, but he's effectively destroyed it by saying all of that. So he holds that man is unavoidably doomed to acts for which he must suffer punishment and which it is not in his power to commit or not to commit. So essentially, you're forced to commit sin. You can't help that you're going to sin. And if you do sin and you're one of the reprobate, you go to hell because of the sins that were forced on you. Now, how he maintains free will while saying all this is not clear. So again, somehow Calvin never process that this is actually a tyranny, that if this is true of God, then God would be a tyrant, and of course that's a blasphemy to say. So he openly professed this. He had no problem doing that. He said that among men, some are created for everlasting life, others for eternal death. So that's Calvin. All right, so and Calvin goes in the opposite direction for predestination. He held that if man is saved just as he is lost, it is in spite of himself. So he held that there is no more merit in being a saint than in being a reprobate. So basically, saints are no better off than people who go to heaven are no better off than people who go to hell. It's just a matter of what you've been, what your programming is, as it were. He held that both are passive instruments of a will which they must obey without being able to modify it. Now, why he bothers saying the man has free will at all, I don't know. And so this does explain the pride of the Calvinists who think themselves to be among the elect, and the unbridled license of Calvinists who believe themselves to be doomed. So obviously, if you're I'm going to heaven, I'm better than anybody else who's not. And just the pride just expands and expands. Whereas somebody's not going to hell anyway, I can do anything I want, it doesn't matter, any sins whatsoever, not going to change my eternal fate, which is predetermined anyway, so just commit sin. That's what it ends up in. But with regard to Calvin's position on the Eucharist, he's not very clear on that. He never clearly adopted either Luther's ideas or Zwingli's ideas. He said that I maintain that it is no less absurd to place the body of Christ under the bread than to unite it with the bread than to transubstantiate the bread into his body. So again, seems to be denying, of course, transubstantiation, but also consubstantiation. But apparently he never clearly embraced any idea that the bread is only figurative either. So strange is what he held. And Dara says that he seems to have adopted neither of the Protestant views on the Eucharist. So again, so you think, okay, with all of this, with these horrible doctrines, how could Calvin possibly attract anybody? We got to remember, people only embrace a heretical system for whatever bits of truth there may be in it, or whatever, some species of good. Because, of course, some of you will have studied that the human will is meant for good and can only choose something as being a good. So, in other words, either chooses something which is truly good or which is apparently good. So, in this case, the apparent good, which is in Calvin's system, was a certain austerity that he practiced, that he himself practiced and required his followers to practice. So, again, of course, in itself, asceticism is a good thing, but when it's done out of pride because you think you're one of the elect, it's bad. But people saw this asceticism or this austerity and decided to follow Calvin on account of that. So that was his attractive feature, as it were. A certain austerity, or actually quite severe apparent austerity. And also differentiating himself from the revolutionaries in Germany, like Luther, who was, of course, full of invective. He was much more calm and deliberate about the way he formulated his ideas. So he was much more, say, academic about it than Luther. He quoted sources and things like that, whereas Luther just spewed whatever dirty insults were on his mind when there was somebody he didn't like or some point he wanted to make. So he was learning. Obviously, he had studied considerably in various universities in France, and he took advantage of that learning. He very clearly had some education, and he used that the facade of a respectable education in order to make himself seem like somebody who was formulating something that was true. Again, he tended more in that direction. Though he did come out with insults sometimes, like he called his opponents rogues, knaves, asses, and various other epithets. And he was, at least with regard to formulating his doctrine, he was more, or tried to be more rational about it. And then so, for a while, Calvin spent time at Basel, was his headquarters. But then after that, he went to Geneva, of course, very famously, Calvinist headquarters of Geneva in Switzerland. And that became the field of his schismatic operations. Of course, heretical too, but our author says the head of his schismatic operations. So the Duke of Savoy in Italy attempted to assert his rights over Geneva, but the inhabitants threw off his authority and opened up the way for Protestantism. Of course, the people in the city who went along with the Reformation, revolt, revolution, whatever you want to call it, were excommunicated by the Catholic bishop of the city. And that proved to be the signal for a violent reaction against the faith. So altars were overturned, paintings and statues were destroyed, the faithful were imprisoned or banished, and that was the way the new religion was inaugurated in Geneva. So Calvin essentially takes over Geneva. He becomes like the king of Geneva almost. He caused the publication of a decree requiring every citizen to abjure the Catholic faith. And he forbade all amusements, dances, and noisy games, which he denounced as being unworthy of the gravity of a Christian. So again, that's one of the things that attracted people to him, was a certain austerity. But even, of course, he went a little far with it. Even ordinary conversation was subjected to a strict censorship. So how exactly he carried that out probably would have been difficult, but people were caught talking about, or probably anybody who was caught expressing Catholic beliefs was imprisoned or killed or something along those lines. But again, even ordinary conversation was strictly censored. Just one of a question. Yeah. But let's see. So Calvin wanted to use leavened bread in the celebration of the Lord's Supper, as he called it, as Protestants typically call it, and abolished all feast days except Sundays. So there were no other big feast days or anything. Only Sundays were kept. And again, after a while, he became quite the tyrant and was banished from Geneva by his own people after a while for being a little too hard. And so again, during his period of banishment, we'll call it, from Geneva, he gathered a certain following, and he would travel around. He gathered a certain number of followers and married the widow of an Anabaptist. So I still have to check whether he was ever actually ordained or not, see whether that was actually valid, but to check that. And there's no mention of any date of an ordination. But of course, he still had, people threw him out of Geneva, but he still had a good number of followers there, and was recalled to the city in 1541, and from that period became a civil and ecclesiastical dictator. So again, here's this idea again of the Protestant idea that cuius regio ilius religio. He has political control of the city, so also religious control. So he of course forbade dances, which probably is not a bad idea, but he did do that. He established a consistory to judge of all cases of misdemeanor in morals, but then he also instituted visits to people's homes to make sure they were following all the rules, and all various inquisitorial measures were organized throughout the city to watch the conduct of everybody. So there was no limit to his power in the city. And of course, there was a certain amount of resentment against it, but he always managed to, after that initially being thrown out and then coming back, he always managed to put down revolts after that. Then he died in 1563 and left Theodore Beza in charge, who was his devoted biographer and disciple who was capable of carrying on his work or his revolution, maintaining his regime. So while all that's happening, Pope Paul III is focusing more on Germany and the ongoing schism in Germany. Catholics in Germany still were hoping for a council that would, or at least assembly of bishops, or a general council, that would dispel the last efforts of the revolt. So Luther is still appealing to a council. So Catholics say, okay, maybe if we actually bring about this council, actually start it, we might actually get somewhere and put an end to this. Because he had repeatedly, we've seen that repeatedly since publishing his theses, proclaimed that he was ready to give an account of his faith to a general council. But yeah, we saw he put some restrictions on that. So as long as I'm not required to go against the gospel, as he said, which of course we know what that means. As long as he doesn't have to say, he doesn't have to go against his heresies, he's okay with that. So we'll see what comes of that next class. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen, sub tuum presidium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix nostras deprecationes et despicias, in necessitatibus et a periculis cunctis libera nos semper, Virgo gloriosa et benedicta. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen.